It's the top of the hour. Putting the U in HBCU. We are HSRN. You are listening to Green Talk for Brown Folks with Ryan Marshall on HSRN.
Hello, everybody. It's another exciting episode of GTBF Green Talk for Brown Folks. It's your host, Ryan Marshall. I am so excited to be here, and we are continuing our conversation from last week, and we were talking about creating a lasting legacy, part 2. And there was so much that I really wanted to get into about creating a lasting legacy and how we could do that for our family. And then also how we as a community, as people of color, can do that for our overall community. And there are a lot of things that I know we don't talk about. I initially had focused solely on the aspect of making sure that we take care of our kids' financial education so that way they don't start their lives in debt, their adult lives in debt. And then I talked about life insurance. That's something that in one generation you can change the course of your family. But I think all too often the point that I'm put out there was a lot of people primarily only get term insurance. And if term insurance, there's generally two types of insurance. There's term and then there's permanent insurance. And there are 4 different types of permanent insurance policies. There's term insurance. So term insurance doesn't have any cash value to it, so you can't grow wealth like you can tax-free in a permanent vehicle. There's only a temporary amount of time that you have on your policy. Generally, it's 10, 20 or 30 years. And then we referenced, and I'm not bashing term insurance at all, but I think what I am in opposition of is there are a lot of financial professionals out there. And I mentioned Susie Orman, and then I also mentioned, he just escaped me and I see his face, Dave Ramsey, talk about how you only get term insurance because any other type of insurance that you get, life insurance, is bad. It doesn't matter what it is, how it's set up, what you're doing it for. And I think, so I'm of the mantra of some insurance is better than no insurance, and I work with a company that does sell term insurance. And that's very important to have. If generally it's less expensive than permanent, because obviously permanent is insurance that's covering your entire life. Term is essentially you're renting the insurance policy for a short amount of time. And in theory, what it says, what a lot of people say, is that insurance is only meant to cover a loss of a primary wage earner's income. But I will tell you that there are a lot of wealthy people that are eating up permanent insurance, not just to supplement a primary wage earner's loss of income, but a tax-free way of passing and transferring wealth. And that's one of the things that we talk about, is being able to create that generational wealth. When you transfer your assets, you want to be able to transfer and reduce the amount of taxable liability that you have, not only while you're living, but then you transferring in reducing that taxable liability and in passing that wealth. And a lot of people pass taxable assets. So they may pass a retirement plan or cash that is, pre-tax vehicles, taxable. We just had to deal with this. We're still dealing with this. My wife and I, who are our family had some assets that they were sitting in a certain place, and that money, when we wanted to start taking that money, what ended up happening was we couldn't get access to that until the taxes were taken out of that money first. And so we just got done dealing with that because, and while we're grateful and thankful that we even have the assets to be able to use for our family going forth, we had to bear the tax liability as opposed to the people that set up the plan, it was an IRA. It was a traditional IRA, and because they never hit 72 years old, which was the age of the government saying, hey, you have to take a forced distribution on your money. If you haven't taken any sort of distribution, because of course the government, the IRS, they want their money in the form of revenue from taxes and taxation of financial vehicles. So it passed before 72, never had an opportunity to take that money. And so that liability passed to us. And so that's something that we definitely talk about, which is so very important. It was a buddy of mine, and I was reading a post that he had, and I'm pretty active on social media. I was reading a post, and he was talking about modern wealth gap. And there is a wealth divide between people of color. And last week I talked about how a lot of term policies, and Penn State did a study a number of years ago where they surveyed 20,000 term insurance policies. We're totaling over $4 billion. And what they found was that 99% of term policies never pay out. 99% of them never, ever pay out. And so that was a staggering number. There were some other numbers there, and I believe it was 45%. No, my numbers could be off because I don't have it right in front of me, but I believe 45% of those policies, those term policies, in the first year are either lapsed or converted. In the first year, and 72% of them are either converted or lapsed within 3 years. So we're talking about almost 3/4 of all term policies lapse or are converted, never make it to the term that they were intended when they were purchased. And that those are staggering numbers. Only 1% of term policies pay out. A study done by Penn State University. And so when we think about this wealth gap that we have and this wealth divide, you see wealthy people have so much more in terms of assets than everybody else in the world. There are some things that people like Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman say that I do not agree with, and we are going to talk about that coming up on the other side of the break. This is Green Talk for Brown Folks with your host, Ryan Marshall. We'll be right back.
You are listening to Green Talk for Brown Folks with Ryan Marshall on HSRN.
Welcome back to segment 2 of GTB of Green Talk for Brown Folks. It's your host, Ryan Marshall. We are talking about living and leaving, not living, but you can live a great legacy and leave a legacy. But our show today is called Leaving a Lasting Legacy. And it's been highly publicized that black families on average have 1/10 of the wealth of the average white family. A lot of it has to do with some of the things that we talked about. There was a lot of there is still a lot of systemic racism when it comes to employment, when it comes to buying homes. You see stories all the time about how, or it's popped up a lot more about how black families don't get as much value in their homes because certain home appraisers, the values are depressed. And there was a very highly publicized case or situation in San Francisco where a family had an appraiser come appraise their house in a really nice neighborhood, and their house appraised for $500,000 less than all of the other average houses. And it wasn't until they asked for a second appraisal and that they put up pictures of an all-white family and then brought in one of their white friends that value actually show. And so you talk about those types of systemic racism and things like that. Those are things we talk about. But I want to read this, and it was very poignant, and then we'll come back in segment 2, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But a buddy of mine put out a post on LinkedIn, and it says modern wealth gap. And it's literally, it is an ownership, and it's, it's something he talks about, and his 4 topics for killing generational wealth. And it's regardless of race, ethnicity, class, origin, nationality, birthplace, is 1, renting life insurance. So we talked about buying term, and a lot of people say buy term and invest the difference. And we talked about what it means to invest the difference is buying term insurance, and the difference between what it would cost to get a permanent policy and what it costs to get a term policy. Take that money and invest that into equities and assets. And many of those equities and assets are taxable. We're talking about mutual funds or ETFs. You could invest into an IRA, or now you have Bitcoin that a lot of people are investing into. But not only is Bitcoin speculative, Bitcoin is also, the federal government is also finding ways to tax Bitcoin. And the whole mantra for Bitcoin was to have decentralized currency. But now that different things like Bitcoin ETFs are being introduced, now the government is finding ways to tax that. So that's another taxable asset. So he mentioned renting life insurance, renting your income. And so what he meant by that was not having any ownership and any closure, furloughs, layoffs, no ownership of your current situation, employment situation. So a lot of times you're at the disposal of your employer. So you're subject to a lot of times the place is closing, or you may be furloughs, or you're laid off, or whatever like that. A lot of people in the African American community rent their homes. And so when you rent your home, and it's been highly publicized too, that African Americans lag far behind in home ownership. African Americans have about, I think, a 46% home ownership rate as opposed to 69% for, white Americans, white families. And so as a result, many African American families never get a chance to build equity into a home, be able to create wealth for themselves. And then we're talking about renting gains. It was one of the things he said, losing principal in the market and then paying taxes on your harvest. And so a lot of us are always thinking about, and the market is going to be one of the greatest places to get any sort of gains. But we talk about diversifying your portfolio and being able to spread your eggs and not have it all in one basket. So there are a lot of people that put all of their eggs into the stock market. And a lot of times, because the market is volatile, they may lose their money. And we talk about buying low and selling high. When the market crashes, or when the market goes down and reduces in value, then there is a concept called dollar cost averaging, where you continue to make the same equal amount of investments, whether the market is high or whether the market is low. So then when the market is low, then you buy the same amount or you buy more shares of that particular fund because the market is low, but because you're making equal investments and contributions into that fund, you can buy more shares of that fund. But what a lot of people do is they buy high and then they sell low. They buy exactly the opposite. And so we rent those gains, but then we take those losses. And then, because a lot of people are in pre-tax vehicles or in taxable now vehicles, tax now or tax later vehicles, when their money grows, now Uncle Sam comes and takes a considerable part of their harvest based on their tax bracket, their income tax bracket. And so it was very interesting, him putting that in a tweet, or not a tweet, but on LinkedIn, and putting that in a post, and me reading that, talking about those 4 things: renting life insurance, renting income, renting our homes, and then renting our gains, a la the stock market, is a big reason that there is this modern wealth gap today. And we have been conditioned and taught to think one way about our finances and our money, and it's hurting people of color, communities of color in the process. And so we're going to jump into that a little bit more, but I got to break it off here. We're going to jump to a commercial break, and we're going to come back to segment 2, Leaving a Lasting Legacy, part 2, here on GTBF, Green Talk for Brown Folks. It's your host, Ryan Marshall. I'll be right back.
You are listening to Green Talk for Brown Folks with Ryan Marshall on HSRN.
I kind of want to focus a little bit more, and we talked about, we were going to dive a little bit more into the life insurance component of that, but there are the 4 overarching themes that I wanted to just kind of touch on again. And my perspective was, one of the greatest ways that we can help to create and decrease the racial wealth gap, create and leave a lasting legacy for our families, was twofold. I think for our children, and I have talked about this a number of times, being able to save up enough money to cover our kids' costs of college education, or putting funds in place where our kids no longer have to pay for student loans or college education, take student loans or student debt. Now, we understand those things really do happen, and you think about those things. But, outside of that, we're talking about making a conscious effort to start early. If you've got $400 or $500 to make a car note payment, why not then look at putting some money aside for your kids' college education? $100, instead of a $500 payment, what about a $400 payment, and take $100 of that and put that money aside and start setting aside? So I think that's one of the ways we talk about leaving a lasting legacy and not allowing your kids to start their adult lives in debt. They don't have to take student loans. And then we talked about life insurance, and not just getting life insurance is so very important for a myriad of reasons, but not just getting term life insurance. And again, I'm not bashing term life insurance. I think it's important to have life insurance. But there has been a school of thought from a lot of financial gurus, experts, and professionals that buying term insurance and then purely investing the difference between the cost of a permanent policy and the cost of a term insurance policy is the best way to the best financial strategy. And I always say you can't, have a cookie cutter approach to a financial strategy. If that strategy works for you and your family, having some insurance is better than having no insurance, because that way you can get in the game with a very low cost way to protect your family against loss of income, to make sure that their lifestyle can stay the same or get better if there's a loss of a primary wage earner. But I think what a lot of people have missed is a lot of people outlive the benefit. And life insurance not only is for protecting against loss of income and whatnot, but it also is a way to pass and create generational wealth. And a lot of African American people, a lot of communities of color miss that opportunity to create that generational wealth. And so as a result, we never really get the chance to really truly pass assets. We may pass assets, but it is not enough asset to cover all of the liabilities that we have. And so we're then passing liabilities. We're passing debt. If you have $100,000 of life insurance, and some people are like, oh man, I got a lot of life insurance, it's $100,000, but yet you have a $350,000 home and you still owe student loans. You still owe about $50,000 student loans. You have a couple of cars that you're still paying on, and something happens to you, then guess what? Only $100 of that $350,000 is covered. Your family still has the responsibility of paying for a home, or taking care of the house, or the responsibility to sell the house. Well, that's okay if something happens to me, and I've had this objection before. If something happens to me, I'm just going to sell the home. Okay, well, we can't time the market. We don't know when a housing market is going to be great and a housing market is going to be bad. You can't sit up and just say, hey, I'm just going to time this market. I'm just going to sell the home and make a profit and then move on, because that's not necessarily always going to be the case. What if there's a situation where you're in a bad housing market and there's too much inventory out there? Right now, it's a seller's market. It's not always a seller's market. There's more people buying than there is housing inventory, but a lot of times that can flip and that can change. And I've seen it where a house is sat on the market because it's a buyer's market because there's more inventory, and so people are just giving, lowering the cost of their houses just to get it off the market. And hey, man, I'll pay for your closing costs and I'll pay for all of this stuff, and your house sits for 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years, just to try to get the amount of money that you want to get. And then after so long, you're still making these mortgage payments. Okay, well, maybe you do get the money that you want to get in a home, but all of a sudden now the amount of money that you've paid out in the mortgage, you have to pay that. So a lot of people aren't willing to keep a house on a year or 2 years, so now they have to take money out. So a lot of people are like, look, we have to be able to pass generational wealth. So life insurance and being able to get to that point where you can pass that, where you can grow that money, and then you can utilize that money and create wealth for yourself. I think that is so very important. So that gets to the point that I wanted to bring about, was just talking about the different types of life insurance, because I think it's so very important. But the four points that I was talking about, and how generational wealth is killed, was from a post from a buddy of mine. His name is Byron. He's a licensed financial professional. He's based in California, and he talks about, one, renting life insurance and just getting term insurance instead of exploring other options as well. Renting your income, with, getting a job, and you're renting your time. You're giving that to somebody else. It's not really truly your time. It's somebody else's time. So if you get furloughed, laid off, fired, outsourced, the job closes, then all of a sudden now that's just detrimental to you. Renting your home, which we talked about, that 46% of African Americans are homeowners as opposed to 69% for white families. And then renting gains, losing principal in the market, losing value in the stock market. Instead of buying low and selling high, a lot of times we'll buy high, we'll jump in. Oh my gosh, this is X amount of dollars. Let me buy right into this. And then when the market tanks or the market goes down, then we sell our assets. So then once we sell our assets, then on the backside, we pay taxes on our assets. Because a lot of us have our assets in our portfolio into taxable now and taxable later financial vehicles, instead of taxable never financial vehicles. And a lot of people just jump to, oh, hey, there's Roth IRAs, which is a great way to invest for your retirement tax-free. The issue is that it is contribution restrictive. You can only contribute $6,000 a year to Roth IRA, and unless you're 50 plus, and then there's a catch-up clause, and you can add an extra $1,000 to that. And it is income restrictive. So you have to make a certain amount of income, or you can't contribute to it at all. If you make more than that income, I believe it's $144,000 for single filers and $208,000, I believe, off top for joint filers. So husband, wife, or domestic partners, joint filers. And if you're over that, then you cannot contribute to a Roth IRA. So then you're in a situation, well, if I want to create tax-free wealth for myself, if I want to leave a lasting legacy for myself, how do I do it? And so we talk about life insurance. And so there are 4 different types of life insurance policies: whole life, universal life, index universal life, and variable universal life. And they all do different things. And with whole life, universal life, and index universal life, well, whole life and universal life, generally, the returns on your money are anywhere between 3 and 5% return on your cash value. So in a permanent policy, not only do you have the insurance component, but you have a cash value attached to it. And so the insurance company will give you a guaranteed return on your money, and you have the ability to grow that over a very defined amount or a defined period of time. And so when we're talking about whole life and universal life, a lot of times I think the argument is, well, why in the hell would you go and give this insurance company all this money to only give you 3 to 5%? They're just going to turn around and do what you should probably do, which is put it in the stock market. You're going to earn 18, 20, 25% or more. Okay. Or, 30, 40, whatever percent. And I understand that logic. You can invest in the stock market, but I think part of the problem is when we talk about buying term and investing the difference, a lot of people really only get the term insurance. They don't invest the difference, or if they do, now their assets, it's invested in taxable vehicles. And so then that's where those things come into play. Now you're getting taxed on your harvest. You have index universal life, which gives you some guarantees. So index universal life, generally, they give you returns that are market-like returns on average, anywhere on average between 8 and 12% return. I've seen quite a few IUL policies that give you 15, 20, 25% return. And so those are very good returns. It's outpacing inflation. Average inflation rate's 3%. And there's no market downside. So you get market-like gains, to a cap, in a lot of policies. But there's no market loss. And so you get to enjoy making and getting those rewards. A lot of times you get to receive, you could take loans against the policy tax-free. You can transfer that tax-free, transfer those assets tax-free when you pass away, and you don't have to take any market risk. Then there's variable universal life, and I think we've talked about this before, that it's life insurance, but then also has, like, in essence, a mutual fund wrapped inside of it. And instead of having mutual funds, you're going to be taxed on the gains, taxed on your gains, capital gains, and any sort of earnings. In a normal standalone mutual fund, you have a separate account where you get to select your funds within the variable universal life insurance policy that are based in the market. So you're taking all of the risk, and you can get all of the reward. But what happens is, because the market is still volatile, in variable universal life policies, you can also lose money as well, and that can decrease the amount of your life insurance policy value, and can take away from that as well. But it's that money would be able to grow inside that life insurance policy, and it's sheltered because of the special tax benefits that you get from having the life insurance policy. So there are a lot of different ways that you can utilize that to be able to cover your family, to create generational wealth. I didn't get as deep into it as I would have liked to have gotten into that, but that's just kind of the crux of what we're talking about with generational wealth. And, we'll continue having these conversations in the coming weeks. But we have to do a better job of creating generational wealth for our families, putting ourselves in that proper position to be able to do that. And then just being consistent with it and changing the course and how we think about where we place our money and what we do with that. So I'm so very excited to have this conversation with you. We'll continue this conversation. We'll kind of split off in a different path, but as the year goes on, we'll have this conversation. But this is Green Talk for Brown Folks. I'm your host, Ryan Marshall. Thanks for joining me for another show. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Green Talk for Brown Folks with Ryan Marshall on HSRN. Follow Ryan's social media on Twitter at Ryan H. Marshall and on Instagram, RHM WealthWave. You can also connect with him via email at ryan.marshall@howmoneyworks.com. That's ryan.marshall@howmoneyworks.com. Join him next Friday at 1 p.m. for another edition of Green Talk for Brown Folks.